Hello. Perhaps you have heard about the economy of outrage. And the whole idea behind the economy of outrage is that the more upset you can get people, the more offended they are, the more they will engage with whatever content is out there. And so now there are whole companies that exist just to manufacture controversy in order to increase engagement and monetize on that. And they'll take a really small thing, like for example, recently there was this big controversy for the BBC about being sexist because for one of their female anchors, in part of the description, they described her as a mother of three. And they took this and just blew it up. And what they do is they get people offended about things that they didn't even know they were supposed to be offended by. Because suddenly, if all these other people are offended by this, then I should probably be offended too. And the more offended I am, the longer I will engage with whatever content is being put out there. And so they're just trying to cash in on offense. And the truth is, most of us would say, well, I'm not that gullible. I wouldn't fall into that trap. I'm not that easily offended. And I know I would say that about myself. I don't tend to engage in online controversies or any of that. I'm not easily offended. I tend to get along with most people. But recently I saw that I fell into this trap because my husband and I, we love reality cooking competitions. And TV producers know that you're more likely to engage with the show if there's a villain of some sort. And so there was one in particular we were watching, and there was a contestant that just rubbed me the wrong way. And everything he said and everything he did, I would just be like, that guy, I can't wait for him to get voted off. But there's part of you that wonders, like, if he keeps going, what's he going to do next? And I realized I had fallen into this economy of outrage, that if we get people upset, they're more likely to engage and they're more likely to cash in on that. And the biggest problem is that all of this outrage and offense is not good for us. There have been multiple scientific studies that have shown direct correlation between high level and consistent levels of anger or offense. They're directly connected with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and addictive behaviors. And one of the biggest problems is that when we look at the culture, the people who have been identified as some of the most easily offended and quick to outrage are Christians. That we can be quick to say what we're against, and we stand up against people, and we're quick to jump into controversy and not back down from a fight. But when we actually look at what a Jesus follower should look like, we see a very different picture that gets painted for us, that we actually shouldn't be seen as the most easily offended people in the culture, but actually the least easily offended. So I want to look at, what does that mean? What is a Jesus follower supposed to look like? And we get a picture of this from the Apostle Paul. And Paul was one of the first leaders in the church. He had this radical encounter with Jesus. He was really against the church at first, and he had this radical encounter, and it changed his life. And then he goes on to lead the church and bring lots of people to know Jesus. And he says, knowing Jesus should change your life too. And he gives this list that's known as the fruit of the Spirit. He says, this is what, when you follow Jesus, this is what you should start to look like. And this is the list. It's from Galatians 5, verses 22 and 23. And he says this, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And he goes on to say that there are no laws against these things. Like, you can't, no one's like, hey, you really need to tone it down on the self-control there. Like, you have too much self-control, or you're way too kind, or way too joyful. That these things, God begins to grow them inside of us, that God changes us from the inside out. Kind of like, a tree that grows apples doesn't have to strain and work really hard to grow apples. It just grows apples. And so what Paul is saying is, when we start to follow Jesus, the fruit of our lives, the things that our lives produce, look like this. And I want to take one in particular, because there's one word in here that I think is often overlooked and very often misunderstood. And it's that word gentleness. Because when we hear gentle, we think soft. And, like anyone who's ever had a toddler, you have to be gentle, if they're around a cat, like gentle touches, or, we think that it's a soft, gentle touch that doesn't have a lot of impact. And that's not actually what the word is. In fact, there just isn't really a good English equivalent to this word. It's an ancient Greek word That's known as proutes. So there's some Greek for you, proutes. And even the ancient Greeks really tried hard to define this word because it's very subtle and it's this balance. And so Xenophon, he's an ancient Greek philosopher, he said proutes, this gentleness, it's kind of like a wild horse who's been tamed, but whose spirit hasn't been broken, right? So there's passion, but there's a tameness to it. And Aristotle said it's this balance between being too angry and never getting angry. That somehow there's this balance between having passion, but not being quick to anger. Some of you are visual learners, and I'm going to give you a visual picture. It's kind of like if I had an egg and I was trying to balance it between two things, like two wooden spoons. And if I hold those spoons too tightly, that egg's going to crack, right? But if I don't hold them tightly enough, it's going to fall and it's going to crack. And it's this delicate balance between passion and control, between power and restraint. And another word that I like to put to it is this idea of being unoffendable, So this proutes, this gentleness, is being unoffendable. And the reality is offense, when we take offense, when we feel offended, we normally feel resentful or annoyed, basically over a perceived personal slight, right? Someone's done something to us, and we can sometimes feel entitled to our anger and entitled to our response. I have the right to be offended because of this person. And Brent Hansen wrote a great book about this. It's called Unoffendable. And he says, unfortunately, anger is kind of the default mode for humans, and being offended has become a way of life. And I think this economy of outrage is capitalizing on that, this way of life where we're more divided and we're more quick to see controversy and to be on separate sides of things. But he says this about Christians, and I think it's really important. He says this: not only can we choose to be unoffendable, we should choose that. We should forfeit our right to be offended. That means forfeiting our right to hold on to anger. When we do this, we'll be making a sacrifice that's very pleasing to God. It strikes at our very pride. It forces us to not only think about humility, but to actually be humble. I used to think it was incumbent upon a Christian to take offense. I now think, and I think this is so key, he says, I now think we should be the most refreshingly unoffendable people on a planet that seems to spin on an axis of offense. And so this idea of proutes, of gentleness, of being unoffendable, that we should be refreshingly unoffendable in a world that is just driven, in an economy that is driven by offense and controversy. And so remember, it's not about being apathetic. It's not about being indifferent and not caring. It's about this balance of caring passionately, but not being provoked to anger or offense. And so in order to learn how to become more gentle, how to become unoffendable, this proutes, I think we need to look at what are the reasons why we get offended. And I see 3 root causes for offense. And the first one is that something seems unjust. And the key word there is seems, because seems is a personal assessment of a situation, how I personally feel about this, what I think is happening. It's not even necessarily based on fact. It's what's the impact on me. And so when something seems unjust, we can get offended. But here's the thing. There's lots of things that are unjust in the world. There's lots of injustice in the world. And not all of it offends us. But the things that do, we can often mistake righteous anger for action. But if you look at that list of characteristics of Jesus followers, righteous anger and righteous indignation is not part of that, right? It's not that the more we follow Jesus, the more angry we should get at injustice in the world. Because the truth is, righteous anger and outrage and offense, they don't really change anything. I mean, we all have that Facebook friend, right? You know you have them. That person who is always posting the latest thing that you should be upset about. That is just an outrage. And sure, they're letting everyone know how upset they are, but are they actually doing anything to correct the injustice in the world? And the truth is, we don't need offense in order to make the world better. But when something seems unjust, we can be quick to offense. The next one, the second one, is it seems unfair. And this is a little bit different than unjust because unjust is more global. Like it shouldn't be that way. And again, as Christians, we should care about things that are unjust and we should work to make the world a better place. That's what we should do. We don't need offense in order to make that better. When something seems unfair, it's not so much global, it's much more personal. I have an expectation about something that I deserve, a way that I should be treated, rules that people should be following, and they are not doing it, and it seems unfair. And anyone who has children know that unfair is kind of their MO. They measure everything by whether it's unfair or not. I have a 9-year-old daughter named Imogen, and she literally told me the other day, "Mom, it's unfair." And I said, "Well, what's unfair?" And she goes, "I have to wait longer for my birthday than everyone else." And I was just like, I hate to break it to you, kid, but everyone waits 365 days for their birthday, unless you're born in a leap year, and then you got to wait for it. And that might feel unfair. But for her, it's not about the facts of what's fair or not fair. It seems unfair. And so she's offended and upset about it. So when something seems unjust, when something seems unfair, and the third thing that really sparks offense in us is it seems disrespectful. And this is where someone shows us a lack of courtesy either in their words or their actions. And again, we have an expectation that I should be treated a certain way and you're not measuring up to it. And I can give you an example. Recently, my husband, Steve, needed to drop his car off at the mechanic before work. And so he asked me if I could do that. And I said, "Sure, I have this going on. That should fit in." And he said, "Yeah, it'll be no problem." Well, I didn't know where the mechanic was. And as we're driving, it is much further than what he let on. And now we're stuck in traffic. And I am just starting to fume inside. And then I drop him off and I'm trying to get to work and I'm late to a meeting. And the whole time I'm just thinking he totally disrespected me. He didn't care about my priorities or my schedule or my expectation. It took everything not to just lash out about it because it seemed disrespectful. And so the natural response when something seems unjust or it seems unfair or it seems disrespectful is to take offense. And we can even feel like I am entitled to be offended. I mean, I started to feel that in the car. I have every right to be totally mad and offended by the way that my husband has treated me this morning. And we start to feel like I'm entitled and I have the right to be upset and I have the right to hold on to my reaction. And yeah, that's a natural human response. But again, we're told that when we start to follow Jesus, we should live differently. We should look different. In fact, Paul, in a different letter to a different community, he says this. He says, "Be completely humble and gentle." That word, prautes. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. And that word completely means in all things. It's not sometimes when it's appropriate or when you want to or when you decide to, you should be gentle. You should be unoffendable. No, it's in all things, all the time, in all of your conduct, in all of your behavior, in your words, in your thoughts, in your actions. This is how you should be. And when Paul gives that list of characteristics of what a Christian starts to look like, someone who follows Jesus, what starts to grow inside of us, he says, those who live by the Spirit need to keep in step with the Spirit. And the Spirit is God's personal transformational work inside of us, changing us from the inside out. And he says it doesn't just happen to you, right? You have to make a choice. You have to keep in step with what God is doing. You have to make choices. There's ways that you participate. If you're a super jerk when you come to know Jesus, you're not magically going to stop being a jerk as soon as you accept Jesus. There's work for you to do. And so for us to become unoffendable, there's choices that we need to do. There's ways that we can participate in that and ways that we can be transformed. Because again, we should stand out. Jesus followers should stand out, not because they're the most offended, but because they're the most unoffendable, because of that gentleness, that proutes, that unoffense, that balance between being passionate but also not being quick to anger. And so, just like I saw there were 3 ways that really spark offense in us, I think there are 3 things that we can do to begin to keep in step with how God wants to make us unoffendable. And the first one is appropriate expectations. And Brant Henson, I love how he frames this. He says, this is people's unsurprising fallenness, meaning we often get offended because we expect people to be different than they really are. For example, my parents have this neighbor and his name is Bob. And Bob is one of those guys who complains about everything, right? And he puts it all on the Nextdoor app and everybody knows. And so Bob recently was complaining about people walking on his lawn. And so he wanted signs put up, that's an HOA. So he wanted signs put up to say, to keep off his lawn. And so they got the signs, they put them on his lawn, and then Bob was mad about the signs and what they looked like and how big they were. And my mom was so upset and offended by Bob. But here's the reality. Bob was just being Bob, right? Like, she has this expectation that Bob should be different, but Bob is Bob. And so often we get offended because we expect people to be different than what they're really like. But we all have that person, right? Like your coworker who humble brags, or your friend who overshares on Facebook, or that person who's always late, or that person who's always sloppy. And we need to adjust our expectations to not be surprised by their unsurprising fallenness. But here's the thing, appropriate expectations is important, but we can't stop there because we just start to think the worst about people and become cynical. And so the second step that we can take to work towards this becoming unoffendable, for God to change us from the inside out, is what I call generous assumptions. And an assumption is just an assessment that I make without facts, without proof, right? And the truth is, we give far more weight to our negative assumptions than our positive assumptions. For example, if you are driving on the highway and someone cuts you off, you almost always think that person is an inconsiderate jerk. But the truth is, they could have all sorts of things going on. This actually recently happened to Steve and I, where we were driving and someone cut us off and they didn't use their blinker. And at first we were like, what's their problem? But we've worked to really build in generous assumptions in our lives. And so I said, well, maybe their blinker's broken. And then Steve came up with something. I said, well, maybe they broke their arm. And then Steve eventually landed on, well, maybe they only have one arm and they have to decide between turning the steering wheel and using their blinker. And, the truth is, they could have been rushing to someone's bedside who was dying. They could have been lost and confused. All of those things could be true. We don't know. And the generous assumption is just as likely as the negative assumption. And so when we're generous in our assumptions, we can say, well, our coworker might be posturing, or they might be worried about finances and they're trying to get a raise. That neighbor might just not care about their lawn and never mow it and don't care about anyone else. Or like maybe they're depressed and they lost their job, or maybe they've been super stressed and they have a big project and a big timeline and they just haven't been able to get to their lawn. And so we want to have appropriate expectations of people are people. And, if that person always acts that way, then why am I surprised by it? But also generous assumptions to think the best about people, to judge in their favor. And the last thing that we can do to really grow and keep in step with this idea of gentleness, of being unoffendable, is sacrificial forgiveness. And the truth is, forgiveness is always a sacrifice, because when we need to forgive, it means that something has been done that's wrong, that something is maybe unfair or unjust or disrespectful, and we choose to let it go. We choose to not make that person pay. And I want to give you one last example about this. So where I've had to put this whole idea of being unoffendable into practice. So when my husband and I lived in Michigan, we were selling our first house, and the buyers needed, in order for their loan to work, it wasn't anything for us, they needed to put in these new outlets. So they hired an electrician, they put in these outlets, and they put one down on our water heater, but he didn't install it right. And so it ended up where one of the pumps overflowed and it flooded our basement and it wrecked our carpet, and it was thousands of dollars of damage. And they didn't offer to pay for any of it. And talk about something seeming unjust, unfair, and disrespectful. And I was so upset about it. And God just kept pressing on me like, you can hold on to your anger, but that's not who I'm asking you to be in this world. It's not going to do you any good. It's not going to help you. And so working through this whole idea of becoming unoffendable, appropriate expectations. Well, they don't own the house yet, and so why would I expect them to pay for something that they don't own? And a generous assumption, maybe they're using all of their money for the down payment and they don't have extra income, but they feel really bad. And sacrificial forgiveness to say, I'm going to let it go. I'm going to cancel this debt. I'm going to let them go free and myself go free, rather than holding on to my offense. Because like I said, holding on to this offense, it's not helping any of us. And so what does it look like to live unoffendable? Well, you don't have control over other people, but you do have control over your own expectations, over your own assumptions, and over your own ability to forgive. And so to close, I just want to close really quickly with one more quote from Brent Hansen around this idea of becoming unoffendable. Because he says, yes, the world is broken, but don't be offended by it. Instead, thank God that he's intervened in it, and he's going to restore it to everything it was meant to be. His kingdom is breaking through bit by bit. Recognize it and wonder at it. War is not exceptional. Peace is. Worry is not exceptional. Trust is. Decay, anger, selfishness, defensiveness, none of these are acceptable. But love and gratitude and trust are exceptional. And judgmentalism is not exceptional, but grace is. And so my question to you is, how will you live an exceptional life? How will you live in an exceptional way? How could you be refreshingly unoffendable in a world that spins on offense? What would that look like? How could you choose to adjust your expectations, to extend generous assumptions, and to practice sacrificial forgiveness?